everyone, back tuning into today's video. We're going to do an eclectic mishmash of stuff for today's video. Looking at the stratosphere first of all, then we'll have a look at the Arctic and North Atlantic Oscillation. We'll look at the ocean, see what's going on in the Atlantic and Pacific, and we will have a look at the weather next week to 10 days as well, so quite a lot to cram in. But before I get on with that, just say about the ads. This links to articles on all of the pages. Have a browse, which is click through links. If there's any articles that you're interested in, you have your space website. Thanks so much for doing that. Later on this evening, we'll probably have a look at the GFS ensembles. That seems to be something that's quite popular on a Sunday evening, so we'll probably do that around 7 o'clock tonight. Let's start off with what's happening in the stratosphere over the North Pole. So this is the temperature over the North Pole at 30 HPA from the JMA, Japanese Meteorological Agency. And the black line here tells us where temperature's been through the autumn, winter. We started in September, just there. And you can see that in November, this is the period of November just here, the temperature's at 30 HPA, which is one of the top levels of the atmosphere in the stratosphere. At 30 HPA, the temperature was generally quite warm. So that was associated in November with a weakened polar vortex. We didn't have particularly strong westerlies, had a fair amount of high pressure in the northern latitudes, and we did have a colder than average month in November. However, we got through to December. We expected that to carry on into December, but what happened is that in December, we had a very big crash in temperatures at 30 HPA, and that was associated with a strengthening of the polar vortex. So PV really got going through December. Consequently, we actually had a milder December than November. Again, that's 2 years running that we did that. Where we currently stand now is that we're colder than average at 30 HPA over North Pole still. Not quite as cold as it was back at the end of December, but even so, we are below trend. The grey line here is the trend line. We're below that, so we still have those cold temperatures in the stratosphere at 30 HPA. Same story for 10 HPA. It's a little bit higher up in the atmosphere. But again, you can see what happened. We didn't have such a warm temperature at 10 HPA in November as we did at 30 HPA, but nevertheless still close to, or a little bit above average. Then the crashing temperatures occurred through December. We've actually lifted the temperatures up a bit through January, but we are still cold on average at 10 HPA. So whether you look at 10 or 30 HPA, we're colder than average in terms of those stratospheric temperatures right now. However, the GFS model is predicting a change to begin to take place. So this is the GFS temperature forecast for 10 HPA from metrostil.fr. These are stratospheric temperatures over the North Pole, and it looks like it might get a sudden stratospheric warming beginning to appear. So this is the 23rd of January. You see that I've got these blue colours here over the top of the North Pole. That is the cold temperatures in the stratosphere, and of course that is where the polar vortex is rooted. Now, what happens through the final week of January is that the GFS is forecasting a big warming event to occur. So through to the 25th or 26th and 27th of January, notice these yellow colours are gathering around Siberia, starting to head in towards the North Pole. And on the 28th of January, the red colours turn up. Now, when they turn up, that's a sign that the temperature really is shooting up to a very warm level in terms of the stratosphere. So a big southern stratospheric warming event is taking place. They're starting off in Siberia and beginning to push in towards the North Pole. As we go through to the final days of January, there it goes. The colours are penetrating into the top of the North Pole. Not the red colours. You never get those right over the top of the pole, or very rarely do you get those over the top of the pole. But when you see yellow and orange colours on these charts appearing over the top of the pole, you are seeing a very dramatic warming taking place. Notice the blue colours are being pushed down into the Atlantic and into mid latitudes, showing that the cold temperatures in the stratosphere are being pushed out by those warm temperatures, and this will have an effect on the polar vortex. Undoubtedly, if it did come off like this, it would have an effect on the polar vortex. Essentially, you're taking the polar vortex roots and you're starting to pull them up. So what happens is that a couple of weeks after these sudden stratospheric warming events occur, you tend to get blocking taking place, high pressure beginning to build. Now, it's not a guarantee that you'll get blocking in exactly the right place to deliver cold weather to us. Doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes cold weather will go to America, sometimes it will go into Asia. But very often when Europe gets its prolonged bouts of cold weather, it does follow a sudden stratospheric warming. This is from last year. So this is the end of February 2009. Had to wait a very long time to get a sudden stratospheric warming last winter. And in fact, it's into spring when it finally occurred. What happened really was a death by 1,000 cuts to the polar vortex last year, because we kept getting minor warmings through the winter. Eventually, each one of those had a cumulative effect to weaken the polar vortex, but the sudden stratospheric warming, that occurred at the end of the winter and into the spring. So this is from the archive at meteorseal.fr, getting stratospheric temperatures over the North Pole, and we go through the first week of March where we see that big warming event taking place, the red colours again from Siberia pushing into the North Pole, dramatic sudden stratospheric warming taking place, and we finish up like that with the blue colours, the cold temperatures in the stratosphere being totally displaced and pushed out again in towards the Atlantic and the mid latitudes. Eventually that came back to quite a lot of blocking in the spring, especially in April. So this chart is from the historic archive at westcentral.de for the 26th of April 2016, and notice how much blocking there was around Greenland and extending up to the North Pole. We had a cold April last year with a lot of northern blocking, especially later on in the month, and there's the British Isles, of course, varying those northerly winds. Now, we can't say that that was entirely down to a sudden stratospheric warming that occurred early March 2016, but it does tie in with what we tend to see when we get these big warming events. A few weeks down the line, blocking tends to increase. And a similar story for 2013. We had a sudden stratospheric warming earlier in the winter in 2013. So this is from, again, meteorseal.fr, their archive of charts. This is the stratospheric temperature for New Year's Day 2013. Notice these red colours already across Siberia on New Year's Day 2013. And this was a very, very major warming event. I don't think the warming event that we're seeing being forecast by the GFS right now comes to this level yet, but this was one of the biggest sudden stratospheric warming events on record, I think, that occurred through the first week of January 2013. Notice how those blue colours are just being obliterated, they're just being destroyed as all of these warm temperatures push in from the pushing to the North Pole. There they go. So we finish up looking like that on the 16th of January, middle of the month, with no blue colours over the North Pole at all. Totally destroyed. I have to say that where these warming events occur, it doesn't necessarily tie back to where the blocking is going to set up. Essentially what's happening is that you're throwing a bomb into the atmosphere with these events. So all the pieces are ripped up and pulled apart, and it just depends where everything settles down then. So you'll still get mild areas even after a sudden stratospheric warming. If you have blocking, then one place will be on the cold side of a block, another place will be on the mild side of a block. So you can't, from where this sudden stratospheric warming occurs, you can't necessarily say that's where the blocking will be. So, but in 2013, that really did produce a dramatic change in the weather. So this is how things were looking on the 5th of January 2013, while that sudden stratospheric warming event was taking place. It's very mild then, bringing winds up from the southwest, but very quickly there was a response to that sudden stratospheric warming through the early part of January 2013. By the 10th, we're already starting to see high pressure building around Scandinavia. And then we go through into the middle part of the month, and that high pressure just increases across Scandinavia, becomes very blocked very quickly. Again, you probably can't say that that's totally down to the sudden stratospheric warming that has just occurred through the first week of January 2013. But it's in line with what we do tend to see, although the response normally isn't quite as rapid as that. Normally it takes 2 or 3 weeks rather than 2 or 3 days. But in any case, by the middle of January 2013, it's very cold, and a lot of blocking taking place to the north and the east as well, and just continued on and off then, that blocking through the winter. It was a cold winter, and it just got more severe into the spring. This is from the 20th of March 2013, where we had extraordinary levels of blocking, and that was about the coldest March in 2013 since probably something like 1883. So, and I'm not saying that's going to happen this time, by the way. I'm not saying we're going to get record levels of cold as in 2013. But the point is made, I think, that generally after these southern stratospheric warmings occur, we do see an increase in northern blocking, and we can get cold, prolonged cold conditions after southern stratospheric warming has taken place. But it doesn't always work out. We had one in the early part of February 2009. I can't show you the warming that took place in early February 2009. But this one actually went against us. So we started it for cold. Anyway, it went against us for cold. It didn't go against us, if you like, mild weather. So we start February 2009 with easterly winds, and very cold start to February 2009 with a lot of snow, especially across England and Wales. And those easterlies did continue through the early part. But then we got a southern stratospheric warming. I think it occurred sometime through the first week of February 2009. And the second half of February 2009 actually turned very mild. There we go, a complete flip has taken place. All that blocking that we had in the early part of February 2009 has gone by 21st of February 2009. And we've just got a very mild southwesterly wind. I think the blocking went over to America after that southern stratospheric warming. So it isn't always it isn't a guarantee. But when we get a southern stratospheric warming, very often we do get our more prolonged cold spells. So if we get this warming occurring at the end of January, just got to wait and see what the atmospheric response to that is. And we won't know for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, exactly what the response is. But it could, particularly I would have thought second half of February into early March, turn very cold. Arctic oscillation next. This is a index that reflects the state of the atmosphere over the North Pole. So this ties in with the stratosphere, really. Back in November, when we had those warm stratospheric temperatures over the North Pole, we see the Arctic oscillation was actually negative. That tells you that you've got blocking over North Pole. When those stratospheric temperatures went cold in December, you see that the Arctic oscillation goes positive. So that tells you that low pressure is forming over the pole, strengthening the polar vortex. Where we are right now is generally on the positive side, not as positive as we was in December, but still generally the Arctic oscillation is positive. The red lines here are the forecast part, and they're reflective of GFS ensembles. You'll notice there's a lot of scatter, but the general trend is probably going negative towards the end of January, which will be this period just here, and that's when that southern stratospheric warming is beginning to take place. So already we might be starting to see the first signs within the Arctic Oscillation Index of that southern stratospheric warming, perhaps sending the Arctic Oscillation, because there's an increase in northern blocking, perhaps starting to send it more towards the negative side. The North Atlantic Oscillation looks like this. At the moment, we're still generally positive with the North Atlantic Oscillation. It's forecast to go a little bit negative just for a few days in the second half of January, and then maybe ticking back up towards neutral. Not a lot going on with the North Atlantic Oscillation at the moment. Again, that's an index that's reflecting the state of the atmosphere in the Atlantic, as opposed to the Arctic, which we see with the Arctic Oscillation. Just have a look at the oceans, and this is how the Pacific is looking. So it's pretty cold in the northeastern part of the Pacific Ocean at the moment. Still got that very weak La Nina taking place. I've got a feeling this might be designated. I'm going to show you something in a moment that will tell you that La Nina may well be officially designated very shortly by NOAA. But we've got the blue colours there across the equatorial Pacific, showing that weak La Nina condition, particularly central base, continues. In the Atlantic, we've got this cold blob up here, again, to the south of Greenland. That's not doing us any favours for getting high pressure and cold winter conditions, really. You want this to be fairly warm. However, we do have quite warm sea surface temperature in the tropics, so that's not too bad. Essentially, you want it warm in that part of the Atlantic, you want it cold there, and then just here to south of Greenland, you want it warm, so you have a tripole, 3 distinct bands of warm, cold, and warm sea surface temperature anomalies. That's to get blocking and a cold wind. So the Atlantic hasn't really favoured us so far this winter, although because the tropics are generally quite warm, I think that has helped a little bit have slightly reduced Atlantic activity. It certainly hasn't been a wet winter. It's not been particularly stormy. This is the cold and warm episodes by season graph from the Climate Prediction Centre. These are part of NAO. If we come down to the latest year, 2016. It hasn't gone over to 2017 yet. There's 2016 just there. So we see the El Nino that we had at the start of the year with those red numbers in the boxes. Go to this side of the chart and you see minus numbers are appearing. So only slightly minus. So we've got minus 0.6, minus 0.8, minus 0.8 again, and minus 0.8 again. So we've got 4 so far. And to get a La Nina designated, what we're going to do is go lower than 0.5 degrees, which we have done for 4 months, or 4 tri-monthly periods, I should say, through the latter stages of 2016, and do that over 5 tri-monthly periods. So essentially, if this box just here has another number appearing in the next few weeks that is below 0.5 degrees, I think it will, then you'll see these boxes turning blue. The numbers will turn blue in these boxes, telling us that La Nina has been officially designated. That's what we see up here, for example, when we had our last La Nina event. Now, it's only a very, very weak La Nina, but I think we will just about get a weak La Nina designated in the next few weeks. Just going back to the weather for the next week to 10 days, finally then, and the red line here is the GFS temperature ensemble average in terms of the upper air temperatures. You see we're hovering around average, maybe a little bit colder than average over the next week or so into the end of January, and the temperatures are lifting up a little bit, so it looks like turning milder right at the end of the month. That's as the southern stratospheric warming will be taking place, of course. So the immediate response for us might actually be to turn things milder, but of course, as I said, it's normally 2 or 3 weeks down the line that you start to see the response of a southern stratospheric warming occurring. So it would be like mid-February to late February that you'd be looking out for blocking to get going and produce much colder conditions, potentially if the block is in the right position to produce cold weather for us. So you wouldn't expect to see things going colder at the end of January. What happened in January 2013, as I said, it's a very rapid response to the southern stratospheric warming event, but that is very unusual. Doesn't normally happen like that. Precipitation shows that we've got the spike there for today, so a really wet day coming up. Then a lot of dry weather actually for the rest of the week. It'll be another prolonged dry spell, I think, coming up for most of us in the next week. Through to the end of January, precipitation spikes are returning as the temperatures are picking up. Looks like it's also turning more unsettled as well. So probably a wetter and milder end to January. This is the GFS for Thursday, then. We've got high pressure dominating. We're very close to pulling in some really cold air that's over the continent. There are these surface temperatures, the dew points through the continent, showing most parts of the continent would again be freezing cold. We're just on the edges of that in the UK, Ireland, and of course Scandinavia as well. Actually, we do pull a little bit... excuse me, put a little bit of that in at the end of next week. The wind turns a little bit more easterly on Friday, which begins to pull that freezing cold air in across England and Wales. Next weekend is interesting. Low pressure is starting to push in from the south and the west by the look of it. And although the winds are southerly, it's really cold across France. So we are bringing those really cold temperatures in across the country next weekend as this low pressure is moving in. That might be producing some snow across parts of the country next weekend. It would depend on the upper air temperatures. It could be a little bit of freezing rain even in that sort of scenario where the surface temperatures are very cold, perhaps not that cold. A lot, but anyway, it's too far away for that kind of detail. And then as we go through to next week, so this is Tuesday 24th of January, the Atlantic is beginning to start breaking through then. So here comes the Atlantic starting to move in. It is still coming up against quite cold air, but very gradually it's forcing that away from us as we're running into the final days of January. It's turning really quite unsettled. And then the ECWF is very similar, so high pressure dominating at the end of the week. Lots of dry, fairly cold weather for the south, not overly cold for the north. Into the weekend, doesn't turn things unsettled as the GFS is doing. Actually, it just keeps that high pressure rooted across the country. Could be quite a lot of frost and fog with that into next weekend. And then gradually next week it starts to break down that ridge so that by the 25th of January milder westerlies are starting to come back. So I think we will probably turn it milder and more unsettled right at the end of January, bring the Atlantic back in, some bouts of rain and wet weather. And then of course it'll be a case of what happens with the southern stratospheric warming. A, do we get the southern stratospheric warming? If we do, then B, it'll be a case of what is the response of the atmosphere to that. You can almost certainly guarantee blocking to occur somewhere after such a southern stratospheric warming, but where that blocking would occur, of course, we can't say until it actually starts to set up. So that would be like mid to late February that we might get some very extensive northern blocking after the southern stratospheric warming, and we're just going to have to see where that would set up. Could give us a very cold end to the winter, but it is not a guarantee. Right, so 20 minutes for today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. Later on, we'll have a look at the GFS ensembles going through the end of January. I would warn you now, I suspect they will be reflective of the Atlantic breaking through for the end of January and turning much more unsettled. But we will have a look at them tonight and see what they have to say. Right, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.